G'day folks, and welcome to part 2 of this rules primer for the company scale system using Tinian as an example. Now in part 1 we went over the sequence of play. I covered that preparation phase and I demonstrated some of the various factors you'll encounter on a typical counter. For part 2 and part 3 I figured the best way to demonstrate these rules was to give a practical example of how these rules play out. In particular, at the start of scenario 1, you're required to complete this sort of pre-game procedure, which involves airstrikes, bombardments, American artillery conducting indirect fire, the amphibious movement shit, and reinforcements. And I figured that by playing through this and showing you how this works, it's a way to demonstrate and explain several key rules: airstrikes and air support, bombardments and barrage counters, artillery and indirect fire, and again barrage counters, and the amphibious movement shit, the transport zones, naval zones, and along the way a few other rules that come up. In the third part of this rules primer, I'll then run through the rest of the turn and demonstrate some other rules, and at the end of that third video I'll highlight some other key rules that come up through gameplay. Now, one of the very first things you'll do in scenario 1 is resolve 3 airstrikes. Just a reminder, there's no cost for these. They don't require a spotter, and these are a bit of an exception to the normal fire rules, which I'll talk about in a moment. As I said, I've placed 3 air support markers here, and I can select 3 targets. So let's select this Japanese pillbox right in the center here. Now, there are no modifiers for airstrikes. So because they're ignoring those defense modifiers, it's a good opportunity to target those heavier pillboxes, which would normally have a -3 defense modifier. Now, during an airstrike, you can use the blue armor-piercing rounds against a hard target, or the yellow high-explosive rounds against a soft target. So we're going to use the high explosives to try and hurt that Japanese infantry in the hex. It is pretty much as simple as rolling the die. It is a strength of 6. A 5 gives us 3 DG/R. So I can place a disorganized level 3 counter on that hex. That'll reduce the troop quality, halve the movement of the Japanese unit there, and reduce their firepower by 2. Now, the R result is basically a route check. You basically need to pass a troop quality check, which may be modified by any asterisks on that combat results table next to the R, modified also by the terrain defense value, by any leaders or heroes that are in the target hex, and by the defensive value of the target unit and any other status markers. Basically, you roll this dice, you make a troop quality check, and if this is lower than or equal to the unit's troop quality, they pass. If it is higher than their troop quality, they fail. If this is an in-column unit, they rout. If it is a deployed unit, which most of these Japanese are at the start of the scenario, they become pinned. Now, a unit that routs has to basically trace a line, an unlimited line, back to a headquarters of their division. And if they can do that, they are placed in their division's routed units box. And they can eventually come back into play on or adjacent to their HQ. A unit that becomes pinned simply has a pinned marker placed upon them, which affects their movement, their firepower value, and they'll need to rally from this to do something down the track. Now, our second airstrike will hit Captain Goichi Oya over here in another pillbox. Again, no defense modifiers, so we're looking at another high explosive attack firing at the hex. And we roll another 5, so that's another 3 disorganization level on that hex. and they're deployed, so they make a route check, which with their modifiers they pass. And our third and final air support marker, and I'm mindful that, I mean, the Americans just need to occupy this beachhead basically. They're not trying to push hard against the pillboxes this turn. They want to stop the potential for the Japanese to counterattack. And with that in mind, I think we'll just target some of the Japanese out here on the right. So the Americans in this scenario won't be pushing against these pillboxes. If they were, I might target the pillboxes, but yeah, I'm not going to worry about that. So another defense, 0 defense modifier, needing a 6 or less, and a 2. A 2 result on high explosives is 2 disorganization levels. Just like that. So gradually we're building up that those levels of disorganization amongst the Japanese and impeding their ability to counterattack the Americans. They'll also make a route check, and they also pass. And the next step in this invasion is to resolve our bombardment. So they are also placed around the map, and we might spread these out. So 1. Basically prioritizing the Japanese defenders that are closest to where I'm hoping to establish that beachhead. Now these have to use aircraft spotting, which means basically that we have to roll for fire scattering and the potential for each of these to move to an adjacent hex. So we roll for scatter first. And I'll basically work through these one at a time, starting with this one. And basically I'm using the sort of northwest result as the 4, using the orientation of the markers. And I get a 5, so it scatters out to the sea. A 2, which lands on target. A 9, which scatters into a hex already being targeted. When that's the case, you simply remove one of those bombardment markers. Up here, a 3 on target, an 8, which scatters down to this adjacent unit here. A 9, which scatters up here, and the last one is a 1, which is on target. So I think that's pretty good. Of the 12, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Half of those are on target, which is better than average. Typically only a third of those would land on target, the rest would scatter. I mean, granted that one scattered onto another unit, which is nice. Now I'll resolve the effects of those bombardment markers, but just to note as well, so this vacant space here, it stays on the map. No unit can exit a hex from under a bombardment marker, so I'm going to be slowing down a lot of the Japanese around here. You can't fire out from under a bombardment marker, you can't rally under a bombardment marker, and they remain in place until the end of the turn. Okay, so now let's resolve their effects, and basically this is a 3 indirect fire result. So I need basically 3 or less, and again there are no terrain modifiers for these bombardments. So this one here needing a 3 or less, it's a fail, but it stays there. No effect here, no effect. Final roll out here on the right is an 8, so no effect. So a little bit of disorganization, but mainly the idea here of these bombardments is they are slowing down the Japanese response. Yeah, in some cases preventing them from rallying. Now, another step in this this sort of pre-scenario procedure is that all American artillery on Saipan may fire using aerial observation. These are these groups that start down this Saipan artillery park, and they count range from this hex way up here in the top right, and they add 12 hexes to here. So if we're firing at this hex here, it'd be 12, 13, 14. And those groupments have ranges of 24, 24, and 51, respectively. So the first two groups can hit out to about here, whereas the third group has a very long range and can hit most hexes. Certainly in this scenario, they'll hit all hexes. Now, when conducting indirect fire, if you roll anything other than a 9, you'll place one of these barrage markers, and the marker you place depends on the initial unmodified firing strength of those attacking units. If you have a strength of 2 or less, you'll place a smoke marker, and this basically blocks line of sight and reduces the firing, the line of sight and the firing range of units in that hex to adjacent hexes only, a range of 1. If you have an unmodified firing strength of 3, you'll place a light barrage marker. And this, for any units that move into this hex, it reduces their movement allowance by 1 and reduces their firepower by 1 whilst in that hex. And again, limits line of sight and firing range to adjacent hexes. A medium barrage will halve the movement allowance of any units that either start in that hex or move through it, and reduces their firepower, again limiting line of sight and fire range to adjacent, whilst the heavy barrage will reduce the troop quality of units in that hex by 1. No movement allowed, with a -3 firepower modifier. Now this fire is it's a bit special. They use aerial observation, so they don't need an on-the-ground spotter. It's indirect fire, and they have fire strengths respectively of 5, 4, and 6. But while they have a decent strength, they are subject to those defense modifiers. Well, looking over the field, there's a few key hexes that I wouldn't mind placing barrages on. There's this one right in front of the beaches, and this one over here on the right. This is important because it is a white firepower unit with a range of 8, so pretty dangerous if they're allowed to fire. So I might try and target these. I'll just check the range on this one. It is 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. So they are just within the range of all of those groups. So we might start with our first group with a 5 firepower rating, targeting this unit here. Now, as this is using aerial spotting, they have to roll for scatter, and that's bang on target, which is good. Alright, so let's check their defense ratings. -3 for that pillbox brings their 5 down to 2, with the terrain being sugarcane. So I'll check the terrain chart for sugarcane, which provides a -1 defense rating. And I think that's all the applicable modifiers. So we roll the die, we get a 7. It's a miss for that first artillery. Alright, our next artillery with a strength of 4 will now target this hex out here. And we again need to roll for scatter, again treating this as a 4, and it's a 1, so on target again. So there's again just the 1 unit. These guys are in a pillbox. So we're starting with a strength of 4, -1 for the sugarcane, -3. They roll an 8. No effect. We have our third and final artillery. This is the big piece with a strength of 6 and a range of 51. We might go for a bit of a softer target and hit these guys over here in their foxholes. Actually, let me think. Do we have anyone with a high disorganization level? Well, these guys over here, but they're hard to hit in their pillboxes. So yeah, I'm going to try and hit the softer target. These guys out here. And we again roll for scatter, and that's the third dead-on hit in a row for this artillery. So we start with a strength of 6, -1 for the sugarcane, -1 for the foxholes is needing 4 or less, and another 8. So no effect on that artillery. So when the amphibious movement chit is drawn, you, in effect, conduct amphibious movement. Now, early in the game, this basically involves pushing units down into subsequent zones. They move from the transport zone to the approach zone, and then the approach zone to the final run-in zone. From here, they'll move on to the beach. But at the start of this scenario, we are just basically moving units from this approach zone into the final run-in zone. And do keep in mind that there's a stacking limit of 3 units per hex. That's mostly not a problem. Now, as these units transit these zones, and keep in mind they move from the approach zone to the final running zone, they are subject to opportunity fire. Now, opportunity fire is triggered when an enemy unit moves within the fire zone of a friendly unit. Now, typically it'll be one side, like the Americans, moving, and the inactive player, the Japanese, will have the opportunity for opportunity fire. It'll be these Americans moving within the fire zone of those Japanese units, for example. When this happens, it's different to the Greatest Day. In the Greatest Day, these units trying to make this opportunity fire needed to pass a troop quality check. That's no longer the case in the company scale system. The inactive player can simply make this opportunity fire. Now, there are some various restrictions on this opportunity fire. Indirect fire units cannot make opportunity fire, and units can typically only make one opportunity fire attack during this inactive phase. And once they have made this fire attack, we place a no opportunity fire marker upon them to show that they can't make another opportunity fire attack. So let's say a unit here made an opportunity fire attack, we cover them up, they can't fire again. The exception to that, the key exception to that, is if units have a sustained fire marker on them, typically from special weapons like a heavy machine gun. And that enables those counters to make multiple opportunity fire attacks against the active player. There is a greater risk that support weapon will jam and break, but I guess the advantage is they can fire multiple times at these encroaching enemy units. So opportunity fire can be made against these units as they make their way, as they transit these zones. You simply add, you'll notice a little +1 here or +3, you add that to the range from the beach hexes to determine the range. A key thing to keep in mind here is that you fire on the units as they leave a hex, not when they enter the hex. So if you're moving from, for example, from this white 1 to 14.53, you fire on the units as they leave the hex. So on this hex, this is the hex and the defense rating you apply. They are not yet in this hex. So yeah, keep that in mind. It's the same with the landing zones as well. So as I said, opportunity fire can be made against these units as they advance through the zones. You have to trace line of sight to the beaches and then add range according to the little blue boxes. Notice that the transport zone doesn't have blue boxes. You cannot fire on units as they leave this transit zone. Now, units that are subject to this opportunity fire whilst in these naval zones are treated as a hard target with a -2 or 0 hard target defense value. Now, there is a typo in these reef zones, have a 0 defense modifier. So it's -2 approach, -2 running, but reef is a special exception, which has a 0. Now, as I said, units they go straight from approach to running. Reef zones, they're a bit quirky. The Japanese can still opportunity fire from the Americans as they transit across here, and this is it's basically sort of a little transit zone. It's a modifier that you apply to those units when they're moving. It's presented quite awkwardly. There's some errata for it. It could be presented a little differently, maybe a little shaded box or something to highlight that. There's a lot of confusion around this. It took me a while to figure it out. But if you treat it as sort of just a transit zone between approach and run-in with a special misprinted defense modifier, then it's not too bad. It is apparently correct on the Saipan box, just misprinted on all of the Tinian reef zone boxes. Once you've moved those from the approach zone to the final running zone, you can move your other units from the transport to the approach zone. And again, stacking of 3 units per hex, plus their leaders, which don't count against stacking. Now once I've done all that amphibious moving, I can take my amphibious movement counter and place it back in the cup. So this will come out again on this turn. Now immediately after that, we add our 0700 reinforcements. They are added to the transport zone. And with that scenario-specific preliminary phase complete, we're ready to move into the main action phase. And I'll leave that for rules primer number 3, which will follow directly on from this. I'll play through the complete action phase, the end phase, and I'll cover some additional rules that didn't quite make it into that playthrough.